Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Very Cold Lasagna podcast, your place for all those filthy casual takes on the world of sports. I'm your host, DylanLasagna. This is episode number 191 of this icy yet spicy sports podcast. And in this episode, we're here to jump right back into the swing of things with NFL Season Recap Month 2023 with part 3 of it. And I know we took a little bit of a detour in the last episode with a jump right back into the old icebox for a little bit of a retro review, actually a long retro review of WrestleMania 20, WWE's Super Bowl of wrestling, 20 years ago, as they celebrated the 20th anniversary in 2004 of their grandest stage of them all. Better times back then, by the way. So that was a little bit of a long retro review, probably my longest one yet, but I digress. So make sure you go check out that episode. Make sure you check out that retro review after this episode is you're done listening to. So yeah, we jumped into a retro review of WrestleMania 20 to commemorate its 20th anniversary. Since it is also WrestleMania season, and I'll just say it's a terrible WrestleMania season, by the way. But I digress. We're here to jump back into the swing of things with our season recaps. We have 6 more teams to talk about as we reach the halfway point of our NFL season recap month here on Very Cold Lasagna, but also is the start of a brand new league year. So what does that mean? Well, basically, it's a new year. Yes, it is in the NFL. Moves are being made. Trades are happening. There's, basically players going to new teams and to new places around the league. So they're getting big fat contracts, small time contracts, what have you. It's a new year. Yes, it is. So we're going to be talking about all those moves. I'll try not to spend too much time on it because it's going to turn into another long boy episode like it did with the last one. So we'll try to do our best to break it down as best as we can in the most filthy casual way possible, of course, with all these free agency moves to kick off the show. Before we get into that, though, a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Make sure you follow the show on social media, on the X and Instagram at Very Cold Lasagna. And for all my audio-only listeners out there, rate and review the show 1 to 5 stars. Leave me some feedback as well, and all the good stuff. And for my YouTube watchers out there, make sure you smash the like button, smash the subscribe button, leave a comment down below with your own takes on each and every topic that I talk about on Very Cold Lasagna in its respective episode, with this episode being NFL free agency and the 6 teams that we're going to be talking about here in part 3 of our season recaps. And of course, share this with your friends, share this with a neighbor, share this with a stranger, share this with your colleagues, share this with whoever you want to share Very Cold Lasagna with, whether it's the good or the bad of this podcast. So that being said, let's talk about NFL free agency first. So the new league year kicked off this past Wednesday, and obviously there were a lot of moves made well beforehand with the legal tampering period, or as the cool kids or the filthy casuals like to say, like me, the legal cheating period. It began this past Monday, and there were a lot of big moves being made during this period. So there were a lot of them. I tried my best to keep up with them, and some of you may not understand that, and that's okay. I don't understand it either. But I tried to highlight all the big moves because if I tried to list every single one of them, we'd be here all day. So anyway, let's talk about all these big moves that happened at free agency with the new league year ringing in so far. So obviously one of the biggest ones that happened with free agency was by the Atlanta Falcons. They signed Kirk Cousins, the quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings, to a big fat contract, a big fat 4-year deal. I think the deal was like over $180 million. And this Kirk Cousins coming off an Achilles injury, an Achilles tear injury mid-season last year. And yes, he is going to make the Falcons offense better. But man, that is a big proposition. That is a big risk for Atlanta, especially for Kirk Cousins coming off that Achilles injury. So that risk better net a big reward for Atlanta. And considering that they didn't want to try to sign Lamar Jackson last offseason, ew, man. Anyway, for the Chicago Bears, Meanwhile, they did re-sign corner Jalen Johnson. So, in a little update from the last episode, where Jalen Johnson, I mentioned that the Bears should re-sign him long term. So, a little bit of an update on that. I also made a little editor's note for that clip. So, he resigned a big fat 4-year contract after they initially franchise tagged him. And then they also made a couple signings as well, signing safety Kevin Byard. So, a little help to that defense from to improve on last year. Offensively, they signed running back DeAndre Swift from the Philadelphia Eagles. Let's see if that makes that running game a little bit better, because that was one of their weaknesses last year. Meanwhile, for the Eagles, to counteract DeAndre Swift leaving the Eagles, they signed running back Saquon Barkley. Like, wow. They really signed within the division, Saquon to a 3-year deal. This is kind of, Saquon is a good running back, but it comes with risk. He missed a couple of games, actually several games within his 5-6 year career. So he does come with risk. So the Eagles better hope he stays healthy. Meanwhile, for the Chiefs, they also got a big fat contract out of Chris Jones, their star defensive tackle. So at least he was worth the money. So they managed to get him out of the free agent market and give him that big fat deal. They also re-signed Drew Tranquill, their linebacker, to a 3-year deal. They also franchise tagged their corner, L'Jarius Sneed, as they tried to work a long-term deal or possibly a trade out of Kansas City. Meanwhile, for the Bucs, they re-signed receiver Mike Evans to a 2-year deal. I'm a little surprised they didn't try to sign him a little bit longer than that, maybe another year or two. But anyway, they also did re-sign Baker Mayfield to a 3-year deal that was worth $100 million, which is kind of interesting. That's kind of like, remember that LeBron James contract that he got after winning the finals? It was like a 3-year, $100 million deal. It's kind of like that for Baker Mayfield. But good for Baker. He actually earned that contract after his resurgent year last year. Now it's time for him to live up to that contract this year. They also franchise tagged safety Antoine Winfield. Maybe they can try to re-sign him to a long-term deal, try to convert that franchise tag into a new contract. Meanwhile, the Ravens made some noise too, re-signing edge rusher Justin Madubike, one of their key edge rushers, to a big fat 4-year contract after they initially franchise tagged him. So a key part of that defense staying there. And then they made another big splash, signing Titans running back Derrick Henry to a 2-year deal. So it does help their running game, but let's see if it actually produces something if they get to the playoffs next year. Meanwhile, the Browns, who not only are getting a SummerSlam in August in Cleveland Browns Stadium, yeah, they deserve each other. The skid marks in WWE. But anyway, the skid marks, they did trade for Broncos receiver Jerry Jeudy in return for their 5th and 6th round picks this year. So at least for the Browns, on a more positive note, it does help the receiving core that was kind of lacking with Amari Cooper and Donovan Peoples-Jones. Those two, they're okay, but I feel like it's not enough. So maybe having Jerry Jeudy, who could use a fresh start, that could really bolster them. As long as, Deshaun Watson can somehow find a way to get back to form. Meanwhile, for the Texans, I feel like they're making the biggest noise right now in free agency, bolstering pretty much all sides of the ball, like re-signing tight end Dalton Schultz and kicker Kaimi Fairbairn long-term, the 3-year deals, signing linebacker Azeez Al-Shaair, and D'Amico Ryans and Shaair back together. He signs a 3-year deal, and then probably their biggest signing to counteract Jonathan Greenard, who went to the Vikings to a big fat 4-year deal. They signed Danielle Hunter to a 2-year deal. Watch out for the Texans, man. They are improving that defense. Frick. and on top of the draft picks too that they're gonna have, they're spending. They spending that money, and I would be wary of them next year. But more on that when we talk about their seasons, in later on in the year. Some releases though, which were kind of interesting, like my 49ers. Although it's not official yet, they're they do plan on likely releasing Eric Armstead after he refused to take a pay cut, a contract restructure, which is kind of unfortunate for Eric Armstead, but at the same time, he hasn't been able to stay healthy for quite some time now. So, and he wanted to test out his free agency market. So, I mean, it is what it is. But they did go on to sign Bills edge rusher Leonard Floyd to a 2-year deal. So Leonard Floyd back in the AFC in the NFC West after some time in Buffalo. So we could certainly use not only some experience from someone that's already been within the division, but also we finally get that man opposite Nick Bosa. Meanwhile, for the Packers, they released their star left tackle, or at least was a star left tackle, David Bakhtiari, to clear some cap space. And they also released Aaron Jones after they failed to come to a restructured deal. Now, why did they release Aaron Jones? Well, we'll talk about that because it involves a certain team that's involved in this episode. So, in turn, Aaron Jones actually signed with the Minnesota Vikings just like not too long after that. So, like, as if Aaron Jones, like, okay, you released me, I'm going to go to one of your most hated rivals, which was the Vikings. Meanwhile, this was kind of an interesting signing. The Pittsburgh Steelers. They were shopping around because I guess they didn't trust the picket line, the fence. And, Denver recently released a quarterback and, because he didn't cook, well, Steelers thought, oh, he could cook. And they signed recently released quarterback Russell Wilson to a very cheap deal, at least. But for Denver, now they got to pay $40 million in cash to him, while Steelers only have to pay like $1 million to try and win the starting job against Kenny Pickett. Wow. Wow. Steelers country, you're going to ride, man. You're going to ride if he's actually going to start. Oh, boy. Steelers fans are probably going to either love it or hate it. But either way, should be an interesting season for them. Meanwhile, for the Commanders, they're also making some moves, like signing edge rusher Doris Armstrong to a 3-year deal, and then trying to help out the running game with Austin Eckler to a 2-year deal. So Austin Eckler and Brian Robinson Jr., that should be an interesting tandem. And then the Packers also weren't done in free agency, trying to bolster that defense with Xavier McKinney from the Giants to a big fat contract after Darnell Savage left. So the Packers, improving as well, trying to improve. Meanwhile, for the Arizona Cardinals, they signed Titans corner Sean Murphy-Bunting to a 3-year deal, trying to bolster that secondary. And then last but not least, another big trade that happened was by the New York Giants. After they the Panthers were the one that tried to trade Brian Burns to the LA Rams, but they turned that down. And this time, they decided to, okay, we'll trade you to the Giants, and then we'll get less in return. So the Giants signed and trade for Brian Burns, who was initially franchise tagged, in exchange for not a first-round pick, multiple first-round picks, but a second and fifth-round picks. And then they decided to give Burns a big fat 5-year contract, which I guess was part of the deal. But damn, the Panthers got fleeced. They got yeeted out of this deal. Of course, Carolina, what a shit show that is. But I mean, for the Giants, it does certainly help their defense because now you got Ryan Burns, Kayvon Thibodeau, Dexter Lawrence, who I think Dexter Lawrence signed a new deal. I probably don't remember, but either way, that defensive front is going to be good. This coming season, but of course you got to improve the back line because you just lost Xavier McKinney. So still some work for the New York Giants, but that pass rush is going to be extreme. It's going to be extreme, but still plenty of pieces to resolve in the blue side of New York. So all these big moves happened. These are the ones that I thought, were the most notable ones as of right now. In the first, the time, couple of days of free agency. There's probably going to be another big move or two. And if there is, I'll talk about it in the next episode. I'll bring it up. But for now, What do you guys think about these big moves in free agency? Do you think they'll have a lasting impact for your team or against your team in this coming NFL season? Or is it just going to be like, no, it's fine. Like, it's what happens in the season that matters, which is true. Like, all these moves that are happening now, I mean, it may or may not have a actual impact when the regular season comes in September, which is like in 6 months. So you'll have to wait and see what happens in the coming fall when these actual moves come to execution. So those are your moves coming out of free agency so far, at least in the early infancy as we head towards the NFL draft next month. So that being said, now that we got all the big moves out of free agency out of the way, let's move forward with the third part of our NFL season recaps in our season recap month as we go from the island of disappointment to the gates of the playoff race where these 6 teams were so close to it, but the gates just shut them out when they just couldn't close the gap. They just couldn't get there because for one reason or another, they just couldn't pull it out. But anyway, these gates closed them out for various reasons as we now go into our third part of our 2023 NFL season recaps. So to kick off part 3 of our 2023 NFL season recaps, let's take a look at a team that had an opportunity to go and play the Super Bowl in their home city, but unfortunately, obviously, did not, is a team by the name of the Las Vegas Raiders. So after a tumultuous first season under Josh McDaniels that ended in a little bit of controversy at quarterback, they entered into a new direction under center for the first time in nearly 10 years. And why do I say a little bit of controversy? Well, in the last 2 games of the 2022 regular season, the Las Vegas Raiders decided to bench their longtime quarterback, Derek Carr, for the last 2 games because they were trying to trade him in the offseason. But when that didn't come to fruition, they removed the keys out of Derek Carr and decided to release him. And when they released him, looks like they didn't really have a plan for which quarterback to go after, because a month later, came in to replace him was Jimmy Garoppolo. Yes, Jimmy Garoppolo from the San Francisco 49ers. So what became the Niners' problem was about to become the Raiders' problem. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, well, injury prone, very conservative on offense, dink and dunk quarterback, check down artist, happy feet in the pocket, you name it. A lot of problems that we had to suffer. I mean, some people like to say, "Oh, he's a winning quarterback. He won the Niners X amount of games." When in reality, once we get further into talking about the Raiders season, you soon realize maybe it wasn't Jimmy G. Well, at least not most of it was about Jimmy G. So, considering the fact that the Jimmy G era was already off to a fascinating start, he had shoulder surgery that the Raiders didn't even account for, and he didn't participate in most of the offseason stuff, all because of it. So, either way, it was going to be a very fun season for the silver and black in Vegas, and I'm not even sure what if any of the Raider Nation was like happy for it. Like, were they even like ready for what was to come with the Jimmy G era in Las Vegas? So obviously, when you look at what went wrong for the Raiders this past season, you look at the start to the season. I mean, of course, like I said, with Jimmy G under center and on offense, you had a lot of offensive ineptitude, as I like to say it. I mean, it wasn't any different when Derek Carr was under center with Jimmy Garoppolo, but actually, it was a little bit worse. They were still a check down merchant team. You know, Derek Carr, not a very aggressive quarterback, and neither was Jimmy G. You know, this is post ACL Jimmy G we're talking about here. That heavily relies on plays after the catch. Turnovers were higher than ever. you didn't have as reliable of an offensive line. I mean, he didn't have as reliable of an offensive line like he did in his last year in San Francisco, but his offensive line was much worse. But anyway, Jimmy G in the games that he played was responsible for most of them, for the turnovers that we're talking about here. And he led the league in interceptions in the 8 games that he played, throwing at least one each game he played. And he also missed 2 games with the concussion. I mean, injuries do suck. And his replacements were not that much better. Brian Hoyer in that one game against Chicago was absolutely terrible. And Aiden O'Connell in both as a fill-in starter as against the Chargers and later a permanent role much later on in the season. He did decent, but I don't think he did enough to establish himself as a long-term option. And then, of course, you had those first 8 games under Josh McDaniels. Alongside Jimmy G, the Raiders head coach in McDaniels, man, it was just a mess. The over-reliance of running back Josh Jacobs, and you try to get Davante Adams involved, but in actuality, they didn't. They relied more so in favor of Jacoby Myers as the number 1 guy. I mean, it's not bad per se, but when you have a talent like Davante Adams, it's just like, you got to feed him the ball. You got to have that balancing act of, Davante and Myers. It's like, isn't that what you trade him for? So, yeah, like Davante Adams was like kind of a disappearing act. You saw a lot of frustration out of that because, they're not feeding him the ball. So it's like, what are they doing? So anyway, Josh McDaniels also didn't make a lot of adjustments in the games that the Raiders were trailing in. So it's like the more they lost these games that the Raiders were in, the more disconnected the players became from their head coach. Even as so far to publicly question McDaniels. This was like another running theme that McDaniels ran into when he was the head coach in Denver. And that boiling point finally reached right after the Lions game in Week 8 on that Monday Nighter. Mark Daniels fired Josh McDaniels after everyone lashed out at him during a team meeting. Ouch. That's not a good way to go out. And especially considering that, the players are basically telling you that we hate you. We hate you, McDaniels. So they decided to fire Josh McDaniels, and Mark Davis decided to name Antonio Pierce as the interim head coach. And also forgot to mention that they also fired general manager Dave Ziegler as well, because, that's the GM that Josh McDaniels brought in. So anyway, once they decided to name Antonio Pierce the interim head coach, you saw a noticeable difference in how this team played and reacted among each other. There's a sense of unity. There's a sense of camaraderie within this team. They started to play a lot harder with each other and for their head coach. And as a result, they were a lot closer in these games the rest of the way, even whether they won or lost. So regardless of the final score, they had renewed effort. They played a lot tougher. They played a lot harder. The Raiders went 5-4 the rest of the way. Sure, they had a losing record, but they finished with a winning division record, and that included an upset win over the Kansas City Chiefs, who did win the Super Bowl. But for the Raiders, we're not a playoff team by means, but they were almost there, and they got a major upset win, at least in their season, which was good for them. And a lot of that has to do with an improved defense down the stretch, because obviously you have edge rusher Max Crosby, who was a near unstoppable force in the front four. But then you look at the emergence of defensive tackle Byron Young, and then middle linebacker Robert Spillane. They made a push over defense early in the season into a bend, don't break one that limited opponents to 20 points or less. So they weren't giving up a lot of points, except with a couple exceptions, but they were creating havoc within their side of the ball. And yeah, the offense was still a very mixed bag with Aiden O'Connell, but again, that defense really turned it around with the change into Antonio Pierce. But there were some positives on the offensive side of the ball, like the newfound bounce at running back, because of course they placed heavy emphasis on that with running back Josh Jacobs. But then once he went down with injury in the last 4 games of the season, they decided to turn it to Zamir White, who had himself a good last 4 games while Jacobs was out. And you look at it, it's like maybe you have a 2-headed balanced attack in the future to take some pressure off of Josh Jacobs and a guy like Zamir White. So maybe they got something in here. So yeah, the Raiders didn't have a great start because of the coaching with McDaniels and the play of Jimmy G expectedly backfiring on them. But they did turn it around once Mark Davis dumped McDaniels and gave the interim keys to Antonio Pierce. And they ended up with an 8-9 record with a 5-4 finish. So yeah, it may have been a losing record, but at least Mark Davis finally has a competent head coach to run things after the disasters of John Gruden and Josh McDaniels. So at least Davis, after listening to the players and then going through several candidates, he rewarded Pierce with the permanent coaching job. And then he hired former Chargers general manager Tom Telesco as his new GM, which ironically, in that game, that 60-point, not the 60-point win. It is like a 50-point, 40-point win over the Chargers on that Thursday night. But the point is like after beating the Chargers up so bad at home that he inadvertently cost him his job, he brings him in. Kind of ironic, don't you think? But anyway, now that the offseason is in full swing, now it was kind of interesting. You had to make some tough decisions with the silver and black as they were kind of going through this potential period of change, like an actual period of change. So entering this offseason, like they started out with $47 million. I'm not sure what the actual number is now, considering how much they spent now. So they do have a first round pick at number 13th, which is kind of not a bad place to be in. Some of your key free agents entering the period before free agency opened was tackle Jermaine Ellimore on the offensive line, guard Andre James, and then running back Josh Jacobs, which was the key guy that the Raiders were going to try to re-sign. So looking at some of the moves that they already made, they do plan on releasing Jimmy Garoppolo, who is going to be suspended the next 2 games of the season for violating the NFL's performance-enhancing drug policy. So it looks like they are moving on from Jimmy G, considering they did sign Gardner Minshew from the Indianapolis Colts. Defensively, though, they addressed one of their team needs that they needed in the offseason, which was defensive tackle Christian Wilkins from the Miami Dolphins. They gave him a big, fat contract. Whether that contract will be worth it remains to be seen, but they addressed one of their key issues in the defensive line, which was, the interior pass rush. So they get some major help there to go alongside Byron Young and Max Crosby. Unfortunately, though, they are losing Josh Jacobs to the Green Bay Packers, so he signed over there. So actually, this is a good way to go into what else they need to address in this offseason. So they got to find a replacement for Josh Jacobs. Obviously, it was going to be a tough decision whether to keep him or delete him because he did miss a couple of games. He was up and down sometimes, but now they got to find a replacement for him because, Zamir White did have good 4 games because, well, let's face it, 4 games, it's a little bit of a small sample size for a running back who it looks like he's going to be penciled in to start. And then, obviously, you got to find a starting quarterback. I mean, obviously, Jimmy G is going to be gone. I don't believe Aiden O'Connell is going to be a long-term answer under center. I mean, does have an opportunity to compete for the starting job in training camp, but I don't think it's gonna be a long-term fix. They also did sign Gardner Minshew, but ideally, you want to look into the draft for that next franchise guy if there's something available. Though that's the thing. And then last but not least, you got to address both sides of the trenches. I mean, offensively, you had below average pass protection within the offensive line, especially at right tackle. So you got to look into upgrading both spots, both the right tackle and the guard spots. So you got to fix the interior and that right tackle spot. Defensively, you did fix some of the interior pass rush with Christian Wilkins, but now you got to beef it up, adding some depth behind him. So the Las Vegas Raiders in 2023, yeah, didn't get off to a right foot, but it ended with promise. But obviously now you have some questions regarding the future heading towards 2024. And while it looks like Antonio Pierce looks like a coach that can really get the best out of his team, as evidenced with his interim tenure, now that he's full time, now that he kind of has a feel for who he wants to go with this team, he still has to answer that big question. Who's his quarterback going to be for 2024 and potentially beyond? So let's go from Sin City down to the Big Easy, or as we called it the last couple of years, the Big Hard, as we now take a look at the New Orleans Saints. The Saints had been teetering on being mid for the last 2 years, and they were looking to change that this past season. One of the first big splashes in last year's offseason actually happened well before the new league year rang in, as they signed recently released Raiders quarterback Derek Carr to a big fat 4-year deal. And now that he was with his first head coach Dennis Allen again, it seemed like the New Orleans Saints were going to retake their place back on top in what was going to be a very weak NFC South, where you had questions all around at quarterback, including New Orleans Saints. Don't get me wrong. The Saints had plenty of questions of their own all around this team, including with their quarterback, Derek Carr. But obviously, there's plenty of questions within the division in and of itself. So when you look at the Saints team, when you look at what went right with this team, you look at that offense, especially the receiving core, Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed. If I try to pronounce that a million times, that last name. But no, seriously, these two receivers were the frequent targets for Derek Carr, and they had themselves a good year. Olave had another 1,000-yard season in his second year. Shaheed nearly cracking that as well. But they were pretty effective performers for that team. And Shaheed doing great special teams work for the punting unit. And they just gave the life to the Saints in what was a pretty stale offense. Defensively, the secondary unit in what was considered one of the best defenses in the NFL a couple years ago, it's kind of taken a step back this past season, but their secondary unit was still a very good unit, despite, like I said, finishing overall as middle of the pack. This was an area that they really shined. You have a back line that consists of corners Marshawn Lattimore and Paulson Adebo at corner, safety Tyrann Mathieu, and then linebacker Demario Davis. They covered the field relatively well, and this is despite still Marshawn Lattimore being lost for the last 7 games of the season. So they covered the field relatively well, despite the points that they gave up due to, barely allowing any big plays from happening in the air. And they were able to create a lot of turnovers with their defensive coaches, giving them a lot of good plays, good reads. So this secondary unit, despite this defense being just in the middle line, they were a pretty good unit. Unfortunately, the other side of the defense, though, they couldn't hold its end of the bargain. So that Saints front seven, that featured star defensive edge rusher Cameron Jordan, it was bad. It had so much trouble pressuring and sacking the quarterback all season, let alone stopping the run. They were a very bad run-stopping team. And this is coming from the fact that Dennis Allen brought in new coaches and a couple of new players within the rotation and tried out various different rotations throughout the season. And the execution on the field just didn't result in what he wanted. So when you think about it in the grand scheme of things, it's just like all you have in that pass rush is Cameron Jordan, and he can't do it alone. He's getting older. He's going to be turning 35. And it's just like, you got to get the man some help. So help him out, man. And then going back to that offense, for as good as Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed are, it's like the play calling and some of the supporting cast, and that includes Derek Carr too, it was stale. It's stale as, I guess, vinegar potato chips. So Saints fans, I kind of warned them about this in my season preview of this. they should have known what they were in for when this team signed Derek Carr and saw what he did in Oakland/Vegas with the Raiders for the last near decade. He's a very conservative quarterback that will take a midfield, that won't take a midfield or deep pass for the most part, but he will from time to time. But for the most part, he heavily relies on the check down and relies on the yards after catch. So that's the kind of quarterback Derek Carr is. He not really a very risky quarterback. And for the rushing attack that's been heavily reliant on Alvin Kamara the last couple of years, it's slowed down. I mean, Kamara's not getting older. I mean, he's missed a couple of games too, so he's kind of had a little bit of trouble staying healthy. And then Taysom Hill, the gadget player, he hasn't been as effective because, well, I guess defenses are reading him better, or the play calling hasn't been good. Especially that offensive line, very, very poor in run blocking and pass protection. It also contributed to the rushing woes of Kamara and Taysom Hill. And then going back to Derek Carr, he was also in and out of the lineup a couple of games. So it started in week 3 when they went to Green Bay to play the Packers, and Carr went down with a shoulder injury. And the next week he tried to play through it, but they got blown out by the Bucs. And then he still tried to play through it with some mixed results. And it became a little bit of concern because there's another injury that occurred. It was a separate injury with the concussion, and Carr got knocked out in the loss to the Vikings. So the injuries, yes, they weren't long term, but one would have to wonder if it was wise to have Derek Carr keep playing through what ended up sounding like multiple games throughout the year. I mean, I commend Derek Carr for his toughness, but it's just like the coaches have to understand, like, if he's like that hurt, like you got to step in, like, let him rest for like a week or two if he's that badly hurt with multiple injuries. So the Saints did manage to go on a little bit of a run to close out the year, but the problem is like by the time they were like that close to playoff contention, it was too little, too late. Like, by the time we got to week 17, they beat the Bucs, and well, all they could do is like, well, we can win our game against Atlanta, but we still need some help from the Bucs. And they beat Atlanta, but they played the Bucs played the Panthers, so it was pretty much too little, too late. They're still eliminated from playoff contention due to the Packers winning their game, and then the Bucs won their game too. So that was a wrap on another disappointing season for the New Orleans Saints. From a big picture perspective, though, had the Saints made the playoffs as the NFC South champion or as a wild card by a miracle chance, they would have gotten their butts whooped because they play very conservatively on offense, and they were still very lacking in the trenches on defense, and that would have exposed their secondary for as good as that played all year. So all in all, it was a very underachieving season for a team that had pretty good odds at winning a very weak division in the NFC South this past season. So I don't really know where you go for here if you're the New Orleans Saints, because when you look at their offseason and how it started, actually before it started, they were like in the last couple of years in the major red. They were like the team with the most red in the NFL. Around $90 million in the toilet. That's bad. Negative. Danito. Terrible. But they did get back up under the cap like a week or two ago. So that was good for them. But still, $90 million over the line. Really bad. So anyway, they do have a first round pick at number 14. Kind of like where they were last year, I believe. Oh no, 2 years ago. So that's something. When you look at their free agents, not too many that they need to worry about, like safeties Jonathan Abram, Lonnie Johnson Jr., corner Isaiah Yedem, and then backup quarterback Jameis Winston. So he hit the free agent market for the first time in quite some time. And then looking at some of the moves that they already made, they couldn't do much because obviously they didn't have money. But to try and get under the cap, they made some extensions to Tyrann Mathieu and Demario Davis. And they did sign linebacker Willie Gay to a 1-year deal from the Chiefs. So, hey, they've been able to do something with that money that they re-got. Looking at some of the needs that they need to address during this offseason, if they can. They're most likely going to try to do that during the draft. They got to rehaul that entire defensive line because all you have there is Cameron Jordan. And he doesn't have much help, nor does he have much time in the league left. He's going to be 35 years old by the time training camp starts. And opposite him is edge rusher Payne Turner. And he's not that much help. And the interior defensive line really struggled in the back half of the year. So they got to use their draft assets to upgrade at every position possible, aside from Cameron Jordan. And then staying within the defense, you got to get some help for Marshawn Lattimore. The Saints secondary, yes, it was the better unit defensively. They still need some help to go and support their Pro Bowl corner. And then offensively, go and get some more help behind Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed, because outside of those two, there's nobody else. And yeah, sure, you had Jimmy Graham, but I mean, was he really reliable this past year? I mean, outside of the one red zone or two touchdown. But anyway, what I'm saying is that they don't have that other receiving threat. Michael Thomas, I think he's done. He's been very unreliable since coming back from injury like last year. So the Saints need to find another receiver or two to go alongside their new duo. So the Saints this year, very underachieving team this past season in 2023. So because they were pretty much the favorite, like I said, to win this division in the NFC South. But once again, they disappointed and missed the playoffs. So as it was in the last 2 years, this is what their status quo is. Stuck in cap hell with an aging roster and just trying to get by with what they can and what they can try to add after getting past their heavy red money line. I mean, they could try to compete again for the division in 2024. However, even if they did, steal the division from whether it's the Bucks or the Falcons this coming year. And the year, it's just going to be like this past year and the year before that, and maybe even 2021. The result may be the same. They're just going to be mid in the big hard. Let's travel up from the Big Easy down to Indy to talk about the Indianapolis Colts. This past season for the Indianapolis Colts, there were no expectations. I didn't set any expectations. Other people didn't set any expectations because, well, they were just one of the worst teams in the NFL these last couple of years. Not just one of the worst teams, but one of the most embarrassing teams because what happened the end of the season where they lost to the Jaguars, where everyone was wearing clown suits in Jacksonville, and then last season's the season prior debacle with the midseason firing of Frank Reich, and then they went out to hire Jeff Saturday, who had no head coaching experience, and then he did win his first game, but then no more after that, including that 33-0 lead that they blew in Minnesota on a Saturday. No pun to Jeff Saturday. So they fired Jeff Saturday. They didn't keep him on as an interim head coach. They ditched him, rightfully so. They also released their recent quarterback experiment in Matt Ryan. So they started over. They hired former Eagles offensive coordinator Shane Steichen, fresh off of a Super Bowl, and actually Chris Ballard finally decided to use his first round pick, which was a top 5 draft pick, on a quarterback by the name of Anthony Richardson from Florida. So despite all that, there weren't a lot of expectations still. I mean, this is pretty much a full, true rebuild for the Indianapolis Colts. But in terms of this year, this was mainly about regaining some respectability that they had lost in the last couple of years. Now, unfortunately, it didn't start off that way for Indianapolis because there's this whole big blow up over a contract dispute between owner Jim Irsay and running back Jonathan Taylor, because this thing spanned for a couple months, from just before training camp all the way in June, and then spanned all the way from week 5 in October, because Taylor and his agent were getting pretty heated over how Jim Irsay just cut off their contract extension talks, and then Taylor wanted a trade, and then Jim Irsay was like, I'm gonna completely blow this out of proportion, and try to slander Jonathan Taylor's name whenever I get asked about it. So whenever Jonathan Taylor's name was brought up, Jim Irsay is like, oh, fuck this guy. So during this period, not only were there rumblings about which teams could try to trade for him, but there's also this undisclosed injury that Taylor was trying to like heal himself from, like an ankle injury specifically. So fortunately, though, it was resolved by week 5. Jonathan Taylor was back practicing with the Colts. Taylor signed a new contract extension. He healed his relationship with Jim Irsay. Jim Irsay had some positive things to say again. But it was just a strange development in how it played out. It could have stayed behind the scenes. They had no need to make it a big deal publicly. So it was very strange. And then what was also strange was the injuries all around the team. I mean, maybe it's not so strange when injury mania always runs wild around this league. So 5 players from the rookie class was on injury reserve the whole season. And then, when you look at during the season, safety Julian Blackmon missed the final game with a shoulder injury. The starting offensive line missed at least one game each week. So you had pretty much a makeshift offensive line each and every week, which is brutal for whoever the quarterback was. Speaking of the quarterback, Anthony Richardson, man, he was playing so well in these couple first games of the season. Sure, he had his rookie pains and all that, but he suffered a season-ending shoulder injury in week 5, which ended a promising rookie season for him. I mean, I feel like, yes, he struggled, but I feel like he was ready to take that next step in his rookie year. And I feel like a lot of the blame shifted towards maybe his mindset of like always having to run, but maybe it's also the play calling as well. Because I kind of knocked him. I knocked the Colts on that. It's like, you got to chill back on Anthony Richardson running so much. But nonetheless, it really sucked that Anthony Richardson, this kind of promising young quarterback, well, he gets injured early in the season. But hopefully he was ready to heal up. And then you obviously have the way the season ended for the Colts. Despite all the things going against them, all this adversity, all this stuff throwing against them, the Colts still competed. They still had a chance to make the playoffs in a win-in situation against the very same team they faced the year prior, and the Texans, where both teams were bottoming out for a top 5 draft pick in the draft this past year. Unfortunately, for the Colts, they fell just short, and that came at a decision to throw it on 4th and short in the red zone right after the final 2-minute warning. It's a decision that still haunts them to this day. And yeah, they're trying to fix some of that in the offseason. But let's see how that pans out when it comes to execution in the regular season. But looking at a more positive note, though, you look at Anthony Richardson. He only started a couple of college games, but he looked like a quarterback, like I said, that was poised to break out. Like I said, he had his fair share of rookie pains that put the team behind. But in those same games, he overcame them. Sure, some of them he won, some of them he lost, but he nearly overcame them with his decision making, his fastball passing, his running ability as well. But unfortunately, that's where it got him in trouble in that game where he got injured. And he also had another injury like there as well, like with the concussion. But as I said before, though, Anthony Richardson, I think they may have found something in him, but they have to train him how to stay around the pocket more. And when he does, that's when I think they can unleash his full potential. They have to find that balancing act of keeping him around the pocket and balancing his running ability as well. And then I have to give credit to Shane Steichen. Despite all the adversity of chaos of this season and kind of having my doubts with Steichen, Irsay giving him this big fat contract to coach this team before the season started. And Colts fans having the thought of, it's another season in the books. It's a wrap. We're getting ready for another high draft pick. Shane Steichen, he rallied the troops. He kept winning games with what he got out of his roster. He made the most of them. And some of those key wins include the likes of the Ravens, the Steelers, the Bucks, all whom were playoff teams. And sure, they didn't beat the Texans in a winner go home situation. I mean, it's still something to build upon for next season, even for as much as it hurts. So despite the up and down season and the way that it ended for Indy, the Colts provided something that they haven't felt in quite some time for both themselves and their fan base: hope. So Anthony Richardson played well in the short time that he did. Hopefully once he's healthy and they design more plays around him to keep him around the pocket, balance his running, he could be a quarterback to watch next season. And then, again, credit to Shane Steichen for rallying this team to a winning record. And people should feel good about him. Of course, keep caution, though, around for Steichen because, I don't want him to feel like a one-year wonder because he can actually coach this team. So looking at their offseason, they started with around $70 million, which was like some of the most in the league. And then they're around that middle mark of having the 15th overall pick in the draft. So they're kind of at a good spot. Looking at some of the key free agents when the New Year League started, some of their key free agents were mostly on the defensive side of the ball, like Julian Blackmon, Ronnie Harrison, Kenny Moore II. And then offensively, you had Zach Moss and Gardner Minshew at backup quarterback. They re-signed a couple of them, like receiver Michael Pittman Jr. He was also a free agent. They got their key top receiver back. They also re-signed Tyquan Lewis to a new deal. They re-signed Kenny Moore to a 3-year deal, so a key piece of that secondary. They also re-signed linebacker Zaire Franklin to a 3-year deal. They did lose Gardner Minshew to the Raiders. So looking at some of their needs in the offseason that they still need to address, they have to find a backup quarterback. Just in the event that Anthony Richardson gets hurt again in next season. So they got to have some insurance, quality assurance. Look at some of their primary needs, though. They got to get some more help at receiver. They did re-sign Michael Pittman, but obviously with him in Downs, it's not enough. They do need more help. And the Colts, having all the success that they had in the draft, they should look towards going to that well again. And then last but not least, address the secondary. The Colts back into the defense, it's been troublesome for quite some time. I mean, they have a good pass rush led by DeForest Buckner, but that back end of the defense, even with re-signing Kenny Moore in the corner, they could use some help with that rotation. And then at safety, I don't know if they re-signed Julian Blackmon yet, but if not, they're going to have to fill up that spot with the starting safety and pretty much that whole room. So overall, the Colts, they were the laughingstock of the league for the last couple of years. Having yearly quarterbacks like Phillip Rivers, Jacoby Brissett, Carson Wentz, and then recently Matt Ryan. But it seems like they have a stable quarterback with Anthony Richardson and a competent head coach in Shane Steichen. And these next couple of months, though, for Colts fans, it's going to be very telling of how committed the higher-ups are to taking those next step of righting the ship towards a better future. So it's going to be all about maintaining that success from 2023 going into 2024 for the Indianapolis Colts. So let's go from Indy to the Emerald City as we now talk about the Seattle Seahawks. The Seahawks were a big surprise team in 2022 that was slated to begin a rebuild after the Russell Wilson trade, yet they ended up being the real winners of that deal by earning a wildcard berth behind comeback player of the year, Geno Smith. Although they were ousted in the first round of the playoffs by my 49ers, the Hawks weren't as broken as many expected. So they went into last offseason by re-signing Geno Smith to a modest 3-year deal and decided to build around him, on both the offense and the defense. They got him a new receiver and a new corner. And so now that there were some expectations for these Seahawks, there's also some pressure on their quarterback and on the overall team to repeat or do better than their unexpected success from the year prior. So when you look at what went right for this team in 2023, you look at the offensive supporting cast. General manager John Snyder did well in last year's draft to get him some help. And receiver Jackson Smith-Njigba. Did I pronounce it right this time? Just kidding. I got it now. and running back Zach Charbonnet. These two rookies did very well with this supporting cast that's led by DK Metcalf, who also had another good year, and Tyler Lockett. So all of them did really well with their quarterback, whether it was Geno or Drew Lock, who had to fill in at times. But this was a pretty solid offense, and coupled with the fact that, again, they got Geno Smith some help, a pretty effective unit. Unfortunately, though, when you look at the Seahawks this past season, Geno Smith took a little bit of a step back. Not to say that it was very bad per se, because he did live up to his contract a little in terms of him being very solid. However, he made some pretty bad decisions with the football, and he took a good amount of sacks, both which killed Seattle's drives, and then he turned the ball over a good amount as well, including him throwing to direct defenses. Yeah, that was a mouthful to say. But anyway, you get the point. Geno Smith, he committed a couple of very ill-advised turnovers, whether it was under pressure or just directly to defenses. Say that a million times. But anyway, aside from my stuttering ass, the defense was still the major weakness, speaking of. Despite their free agent additions and their draft additions, like Bobby Wagner at linebacker, he came back. And then Devin Witherspoon, who they drafted with their first pick. The Seahawks were still getting burned in all facets. Like, it's kind of strange. Despite making all these additions, like on paper, they were still getting burned. Maybe it's like a system issue. And it doesn't help when safety Julian Love, he doesn't have help on his end, because Jamal Adams missed a good amount of games with injury. And even when he was in the game, he lost a step. He has been losing steps. Like, he's been getting burned at this point of his career. Also not helping the defense was a pass rush that still couldn't get to the quarterback, other than defensive tackle Leonard Williams in his Pro Bowl year. And then when you look at the Seahawks, they underwent another 4-game losing skid. And it's not necessarily a 4-game losing skid, but it's another losing skid that ended up hurting them in the long run in terms of the season. Because when you look at weeks 11 to 14 for Seattle, they underwent a losing streak of sorts due to a variety of factors, whether it was poor performance or missing Geno Smith in those games. It was just like, besides their defense, like, and all that, all those losses came against NFC opponents. They even got swept by the 49ers in a 3-week span that knocked them out of the division race. And they were, at one point, out of the playoff race. So even though they did win 2 games against the Eagles and the Titans to get themselves back in that temporary spot at number 7, they cost themselves a valuable chance to solidify that spot in their home finale against the Steelers. Another winnable game for them. So a very costly game for them, because it didn't matter if they beat Arizona the next week, because, well, even if they didn't matter. The Packers went on to beat the Bears at home to get that last spot in the playoffs. So sure, the Seahawks matched their record from 2022, 9-8. Good for them. The problem is, from a deeper standpoint, whether you're a Seahawks fan or not, this season was disappointing, because they had their chances to win games that they were supposed to win, and they didn't, due to a bad defense, and Geno just took a step back. And it's not to say this is all on Geno Smith, but I feel like the coaching, it was kind of questionable in certain situations. Maybe that was kind of another reason why, Pete Carroll went from the head coach to an advisory role, and they made that switch to go get the Baltimore Ravens defensive coordinator, Mike McDonald. That's his name. Like, that was his name. But either way, they hired the Baltimore Ravens defensive coordinator to be their new head coach. So maybe that could be the lightning in the bottle that the Seahawks needed to try to stay alive in this going to be a competitive NFC West in 2024. So in terms of 2023, though, they cost them themselves. They shot themselves in the foot one too many times in this season. So it's essentially a little bit of a rerun of the prior season in 2022, only this time they didn't make the playoffs. So it wasn't bad per se, like for Seattle season, but it also wasn't good either. So I guess it was mid. So looking at their offseason, like I said, you have a new head coach with their former Ravens defensive coordinator. I kind of forgot their name. I'm not sure if it was Mike McDonald. But either way, they have around $12 million to spend initially. Their first round pick is at number 16th overall. So they have some things to consider, like who are they going to re-sign? Their initial list of free agents was Leonard Williams at defensive tackle, linebacker Bobby Wagner, although they did say they're not going to bring him back. Guard Damian Lewis, and then tight end Noah Fant. They did re-sign 2 of the 4 here, like Leonard Williams and Noah Fant. They also did commit to quarterback Geno Smith for this season, so I guess that's newsworthy. They released safeties Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams. There's a little curious choice there, but maybe they are getting older for the Seahawks. And they did re-sign Tyler Lockett to a new 2-year deal, as well as re-signing, like I said, Noah Fant and Leonard Williams to multi-year deals. So some of the things that the Seahawks still need to address this offseason is, well, they got to get Leonard Williams some help because that pass rush is non-existent. Seattle's front 4 could barely generate any pressure. They really need to commit to both this free agency and the draft to beefing up that entire defensive line, because if they don't, they're going to have trouble stopping the run and getting to the quarterback again this coming fall. And they got to fix up that interior offensive line, because the offensive line wasn't bad as many others I've talked about previously, but it's still a noticeable weakness. Like at right guard, that interior offensive line has had its issue. Like many defenses were able to get to Geno at a very quick rate. So they should look into finding some new guards at both spots to solidify that offensive line. And then last but not least, I think I said this last year when I talked about the Seahawks, you got to consider finding a quarterback to groom, for Geno to mentor. Because, like I said, Geno hasn't played bad per se, but when you look at his play this past season and the news of Seahawks committing to him just in 2024, isn't that considered a red flag that they are unsure of Geno long term? So just something to think about. So the Seahawks maybe should consider looking into using one of their day 2 picks to find a possible successor at quarterback whenever Geno fizzles out. So for the Seahawks, they didn't necessarily have a bad season this year. It just wasn't a very exciting nor good one either. Like I said, mid. So the Seahawks going into 2024, when you have the Rams, the Niners, and maybe even the Cardinals, all likely to compete within that division, you have to consider, do you really want more of the same or even less in these last 2 years, or maybe even to come this year, going to 2024? It's something to think about as you usher in a new regime going into the Emerald City. So now let's go from the Emerald City to one of my favorite spots, the land of all elite, to talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jaguars, they started 2023, a year at least, by coming back from a 27-point deficit to the LA Chargers in the first round of the playoffs. And even though they lost to the eventual Super Bowl 57 champion Chiefs the following week, I thought, the future was much brighter for the Jacksonville Jaguars than it had been for a pretty long time. Especially considering, just a couple of years ago that they were in dark ages with the whole Urban Meyer debacle, the Urban Meyer season of 2021. Yeah, and that was an all-elite season, wasn't it? But anyway, they didn't make a whole lot of moves last offseason, entering 2023, but they were still pegged to run away with an AFC South division in rebuilding. 2 rookie quarterbacks within that division with the Colts and the Texans, and then you had a team in the Titans that was on the verge of rebuilding, which they are now, obviously. So when you look at the positives for these Jacksonville Jaguars this past season, you look at the firepower on offense. You just look at that offense that's led by Trevor Lawrence. And sure, they had a couple rough stretches in the first half of the year, but that offense started to play pretty good down the stretch in at least the first first portion of the season after that rough patch. When you look at that offensive firepower with running back Travis Etienne, he was pretty much the engine of that group. He had a very effective year, going for 11 total touchdowns and having 2 signature performances against the Buffalo Bills and the Steelers on the road. Especially that Steelers game where it was very rainy. Trevor Lawrence could barely throw the ball, and he was just a very effective running back in his second full year as a starter. Meanwhile, in the passing game, Calvin Ridley, coming off a year-long suspension for gambling, a very effective receiver for Lawrence. And Evan Ingram at tight end, also a very effective weapon in both the short and downfield receiving game. And then defensively, you look at the pass rush of Trayvon Walker and Josh Allen, not the quarterback, the linebacker. They were a force in the trenches, teaming up for 27 sacks, and Allen had a really good overall year, notching 17 of those, and he started every single game, so he was always available, never injured. So that pass rushing tandem, a really good force that could always get to the quarterback. But unfortunately, though, because of what happened in the middle of the season, actually middle of the season down to the rest of the season, all that positives get overshadowed because of, well, the Jaguars melted. They had not just any melted, they had an all elite meltdown to end the season. How did they begin? Well, I mean, it wasn't all that bad. The Jaguars were riding the high of a 6-2 start to start the season. And yeah, they had a brutal home beatdown off a bye week by the 49ers, who were also coming off a bye week. They did bounce back. They won the next 2 games, including a road win over the Texans, avenging that week 3 upset at home that they suffered. But just when you thought that they were going to beat the Bengals that were without Trevor Lawrence, Joe Burrow, on a Monday night, Trevor Lawrence, speaking of, he injures his ankle in the 4th quarter. And I thought that was going to be a season-ending injury, but it was just an ankle sprain. But the Jags still lose in overtime nonetheless. So the Lawrence injury is not as serious as it was. Fans still had hoped that the Jaguars would win the division still and make a run. Nope. The Jaguars lost their next 3 games in convincing fashion, mind you, with their only win coming against the shitty Panthers. And this was without Trevor Lawrence. But I mean, hell, you're playing against the shitty Panthers team with no offense, no defense, no nothing to speak of. So, all they had to do was do what they needed to do. Beat the lowly Titans, get ready to check out for the season, and that's what would net them the AFC South. That's all they had to do. They had the whole world in their hands, but nope, they didn't do that right either, because they let the Titans outclass them. They let the Titans beat them, and the Titans avenged last year's season finale loss to complete the Jaguars' all elite collapse. And you know who the catalyst for that collapse was? Tony Khan. Yeah, the owner of All Elite Wrestling. No, I'm just kidding. No, it wasn't. It was actually Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence, he decided to play through his ankle sprain after he suffered it in that game against Cincinnati. But when he decided to do that, he pretty much lost pretty much most of the things that made him effective. The mobility out of the pocket, because when you lose that ability to move out of the pocket, especially when you're playing on an ankle, I mean, I'm no doctor per se, but I do notice, even as a filthy casual, is that you're limited to stay in the pocket. And his turnover issues that were already a problem early in the season became an even greater problem during this losing streak, whether it was via interception or getting strip sack fumbled. And it's just becoming apparent that these limitations were going to come with this ankle injury. So now helping the ankle issue was a shoulder injury he suffered in that Bucs game. And I guess even sitting out against the Panthers wasn't enough to stop the bleeding of his issues. So when you look at the Jaguars, they finished 9-8, but man, they had like the best odds by default because of the very weak AFC South at the time, before the season started. And by midseason, despite their offseason approach, and Lawrence's down year, still had a chance to win it. But nope. The moment that Lawrence decided to play through his ankle sprain, try to play hero ball, and all that good jazz, it just wasn't getting any better. They collapsed. They started losing consistently and methodically. And that's when they blew it all away. Not even making the playoffs. That's what you call an all-elite meltdown in the land of all elite wrestling. Yeah, they're made for each other, man. Trevor Lawrence and Tony Khan, Doug Peterson, yeah, they're made for each other in the land of AEW. So when you look at this offseason, how do they bounce back from this collapse, this all-elite collapse? Well, they do have $29 million in cap space. That's what they started with. Not too much money when you think of it. They do have a first-round pick at number 17. Kind of not an ideal place that you want to be at. But nonetheless, you look at some of their free agents like Josh Allen, the linebacker, corners Chris Claybooks and Trey Herndon, and receivers Calvin Ridley and Jamal Agnew. Obviously, the ones I'd be looking at were Josh Allen, the linebacker, and Calvin Ridley. So some of the moves that they already made was franchise tagging Josh Allen, re-signing guard Urza Cleveland and to a 3-year deal. They did make a couple of signings, like receiver Gabe Davis from the Buffalo Bills to a 3-year deal, and they signed Packers safety Darnell Savage to that same kind of deal to help their defense. And probably the most interesting move of all this offseason was a trade. In return for a 6th-round pick, the Jaguars decided to trade for Patriots quarterback Mac Jones. Yeah. The quarterback was in the same draft class as Trevor Lawrence. They traded for him in return for a 6th-round pick. Like, why? Like, why do they need Mac Jones? Like, I mean, I get it. Maybe Mac Jones wants a fresh start, but of all the teams that had interest in him, it was the Jaguars. I'm not surprised Tony Khan wants him. Maybe Mac Jones can go wrestle on Rampage or something. Go wrestle Orange Cassidy or who else is a jobber on Rampage? One of the best friends. One of the best friends on Rampage. Ray Phoenix. He can wrestle Ray Phoenix on Rampage, or someone on Collision. Either way, it's like, why? Maybe he just wants to get some experience on how to choke away a season. I don't know. Maybe, well, at least on a positive note, he just has an offensive-minded coach in Doug Peterson. I guess that's something. But anyway, I was looking at some of the needs that they still need to address this coming offseason or ongoing offseason. They got to address the interior offensive line. I mean, they did re-sign guard Urza Cleveland, but some of their other players are still very unreliable. So they got to look into finding eventual replacement in the draft. So use some of those picks to fix up the offensive line and look at addressing the cornerback spots. So one weakness I did mention was Jacksonville's passing defense, which was one of the worst in the league with how much they gave up to opposing receivers. So go and get some better starting corners. They did address the safety spot, but that's like within the deep middle of the field. So continue to address the secondary. Go and get yourself some starting corners. So even if the Jaguars weren't slated to go past the first round or the divisional playoffs in 2023, they still wouldn't have been runaway division champions. But instead, they now head into an offseason asking themselves what went wrong, monitoring what 2 ahead of scheduled teams in the Colts and the Texans do to add to their successful seasons and competing for the crown next fall. So the Jaguars in 2023, you can consider it an all-elite meltdown from none other than the all-elite Jacksonville Jaguars. But I mean, I guess in all saying, you guess there's one person to blame, and that's Tony Khan, because he stands on big business with Mercedes Moné. So the final team that we're going to be talking about in part 3 of our 2023 NFL season recap is a team that had expectations to go back to the Super Bowl, but unfortunately did not, is the Cincinnati Bengals. After 2 straight seasons ending in heartbreak in the Super Bowl, in the AFC title game, The Bengals were seeking to get back to the big game and finally finish their story and claim their first ever Super Bowl title. Unfortunately, man, this is kind of rough. Those dreams took a scary turn for the Bengals as soon as training camp when Joe Burrow limped off the field in a lot of pain. It like a social media video saw it. It's like, oof, this is bad. And for the team and its fans, though, it was a major injury avoided. And Burrow was expected to be back in time for the opener in Cleveland from a calf strain. So it wasn't anything too bad at first. But due to all that missing time from training camp, Burrow and the Bengals were really out of sync to start off the year. They got plastered and brutalized by Cleveland, and they went on their way to a 1-3 start. Now, they did turn it around with a little 4-game winning streak over Arizona, the Seahawks, the 49ers, and the Bills, but that offense really had its switch flipped every week in that stretch. They were still all out of sorts. Like, they were really inconsistent per se. Now, when you look at the Bengals, what else went wrong for this season? Well, you just look at what happened in Baltimore in Week 11. Joe Burrow suffering that mid-season wrist injury that ended his season. So this was days after the Bengals were upset by the Texans at home. They had to go on the road, face the Ravens on the short week, and they were already being dominated by that strong defense. Things got worse towards the end of the first half. Sure, the Bengals scored a touchdown to make it close, but Burrow got tackled on his throwing wrist, which was already having issues pregame. So you have Burrow already struggling. Now he's hurt. And as with the many other quarterback injuries that were happening earlier in the season, you knew once Burrow left the game and was later ruled out for the season, Cincy's season and any playoff aspirations were pretty much over. Well, until it quite wasn't. More on that in a bit, because there's one more issue that the Bengals had this season, and that was in the secondary. Because when Jesse Bates left to go to Atlanta, that was going to be an issue, of course, but it's an issue that still can't be knocked on, because Cincy's passing defense was a very bad unit, especially in the deep middle of the field. Like, it was a dam ready to crack open and then burst. They just gave up way too many big plays and allowed too many points on a frequent basis. So that's something that they really need to address in the offseason. But on a more positive note, going back to the point of, Cincy's playoff aspirations, like seemingly not over yet, you have to look back at Jake Browning, the backup quarterback. He surprisingly played well for as long as he could. While it was rough sledding at first with that Pittsburgh game, Browning went on to perform better than expected. He kept the offense engaged in the air and with his legs, spreading the ball around to Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, his main receiving core, as well as Tyler Boyd, and even got some backups involved as well. So, yeah, he faltered down the stretch against the Steelers and the Chiefs. He still went on to finish the year with 12 total touchdowns, and that included 3 rushing touchdowns in place of the injured Burrow. So, hey, I got to commend Jake Browning for coming in, like, not much experience, if any at all, and putting on, like trying to get the Bengals in playoff contention into the playoffs. So in the grand scheme of things, overall, the Bengals had so much adversity going into the season. They got off to a very rough start, and just as they were going to turn things around, they lose Joe Burrow. Not just in training camp, but later mid-season. But they almost got there. They almost got to the playoff. But unfortunately, just too many things, like the slow start, the multi-week injuries, having one of the hardest schedules in the league to top it all off, just too much to overcome. But on a more positive note, they did finish the season with a winning record of 9-8, and sure, it was last place in the division, but they could say that they won with the winning record, which was a first in the NFL. Every team in the AFC North division had a winning record, which is probably going to be hard to replicate for years to come. So looking at this offseason for the Cincinnati Bengals, it could be harder, easier to try and get back to that point of going going back to the playoffs or even the conference championship game. But they have some leeway. They have some money to spend, like $52 million, and the 18th pick in the NFL draft. But man, they have some decisions to make. Like looking at the free agent list, it's a kind of lengthy one and some key ones to make, like receivers, T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd. And you look at guard Max Sharping and tackle Jonah Williams, nose tackle DJ Reader, and then corner Chidobe Awuzie. So a lot of decisions that the Bengals have to make with their core. They franchise tagged Tyler Boyd, but he requested a trade after the two sides couldn't come to a long-term deal. So they have to make a decision, either trade away Tyler Boyd or hope that they can convince him to make a deal. If not, then they got to replace him. They did get some help in the secondary, like signing Geno Stone to a 2-year deal. But they did trade away Joe Mixon to the Texans. But in return, they signed Colts running back Zach Moss to a 2-year deal. So there's still a lot of things for the Bengals to fix up in the offseason. So looking at some of their needs to address is going back to that offensive line, which is almost perfect, which is almost solidified, except for two problem spots. The guard and the right tackle. Tackle Jonah Williams looked really lost each time he was out there. So looks like they can replace him. Right guard, whether it's Max Sharping, Cody Ford, the Bengals, I believe they resigned him. But he could be more served as a depth piece. So the Bengals really need to find some long-term starters at the spots. They're probably not going to find it in free agency any further, but maybe in the draft, they can finally find someone to solidify those spots. And then they got to address the cornerback spots. Uze is a top name. I noted earlier that the Bengals, they just lost him to the Titans. So they really need to use the draft to find two potential gems to replace him. And I say two because their corner spots are kind of iffy. So the Bengals, their playoff hopes were pretty much dashed when Joe Burrow got hurt in training camp. They were off to a very slow start. And then again in that game against Baltimore midseason. But I mean, they did their damnedest to try to stay alive in the playoff race, but their limitations with Jake Browning and the many other struggles with the team that came with it, it just reached their toll despite ending the season with a winning record. So if the Bengals want to make it back to the playoff dance this coming fall, they're not only going to have to retool on both sides of the ball, but the most important thing, which is key for a lot of teams, and that is stay healthy. So that is a wrap on part 3 of our 2023 NFL season recaps, as we talked about the Las Vegas Raiders, the Indianapolis Colts, the New Orleans Saints, the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Seattle Seahawks, and the Cincinnati Bengals, the 6 teams that were almost near the playoff hunt, but they were shut out at the very last moment with the playoff gates closing, shutting them out. But anyway, let me know your thoughts on these 6 teams and their seasons, whether you're fans of them or not. And yeah, let's have a conversation about them in the comments on YouTube, or send me a message on social media on X and Instagram at Cold Lasagna. So we are about halfway through our NFL season recap month for 2023, as we now get into the playoff teams for our season recaps, starting with the wild card teams. The couple of teams that made it to the dance, but ultimately fell down, were one and done. So yeah, we'll talk about that in part 4 of our 2023 NFL season recaps in the next episode. But for now, that is it for Very Cold Lasagna, episode number 191 of this icy yet spicy podcast. And as always, keep the lasagna very cold in the fridge with your takes on the world of sports. And until the next one, peace out.